Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1046, and it's a very lovely day today, a bit hot. I hope the cicadas don't bother you while watching, listening. I will continue with the text of Casey, and once more I will link to the text in the description. And I have to mention that me stumbling upon the text was an absolute accident. The previous text by John Sallis had an unintentional cut. Yes, that was it was. So somebody copied it from the magazine Philosophy, and in the same edition there was another author having a very similar title, and I took it to be of the same author, since there was no description on who wrote it in the beginning of the article. I don't know how that came about. It's a bit weird, because this is not how it is in the magazine, of course. But since it's incredibly interesting, I continue with Casey's origins, and there have been already some gems coming up from the text, and also in my thinking that it stirred. One could call Heidegger violently anti-metaphysical. That sounds much more than it is. It is not that horribly complicated. That's a hint to the neologisms of Heidegger. They are not at all as complicated as they look from the beginning. And sometimes descriptions can make you fall into the metaphysical. Good point would be about the neologisms of Heidegger is that they don't make any sense to you. They should not make any sense. And once, I would say in the beginning, when you start to understand them, you don't like them. Reason for this is, it's fair to say, if you read Heidegger, you come from a metaphysical standpoint. So you should not like what he writes, because he's anti-metaphysical. If you like it, you haven't understood it. And of course, that is how it's going to be in the beginning. But trust me, it is not something likable by my metaphysical mind or any other metaphysical mind. It shouldn't even make sense. Yeah, it should not make sense. It will, however, make sense. Sense will come eventually. Last time we were talking about Streit and difference, which in the Heideggerian take is Unterschied. It is generative and not merely divisive. That is very important to remember. There is difference, also named rift, retreat, withdrawal, at the Heideggerian origin. Nevertheless, however intrinsic it may be to the process of origination, difference is not the last word. The Urstreif between earth and world is said to attain the simplicity of intimacy and even a state of repose. The two opponents being carried into the source of their unity by virtue of their common ground. a strife-born origin is reunified out of the intensity of its own internal conflict. It is this moment of assured reunification which calls out Derrida's sardonic skepsis. For it represents the long shadow of metaphysics still darkening the thought of someone as trenchantly anti-metaphysical as Heidegger himself. Derrida detects the same shadow falling on Heidegger's unexamined phonocentrism, on his all-too-Platonic notion of fallenness, and on his privileging of authenticity and nearness. But it is Heidegger's allegiance to reunification within the origin which is most distressful and most demanding of deconstruction. The same allegiance is revealed in the continual Heideggerian recourse to words prefixed by ge. This is almost where we ended last, which connotes a gathering of grouping. Geviert, geeignet, gestell, gemüt, Gedächtnis, Geschick. Geschick is especially noteworthy in the present context. It refers to the way that being originates in a box. Das Geschick des Seins is a destinal sending of being from a gathering origin. But what, asks Derrida, if there is no assurance of such an origin, no gathering before, and even as a Geschick, no repose, no common ground? What if the origin, rather than being a grouped indivisibility, is always already divided from itself, so unredeemably that there is no prospect of reunification except by means of a metaphysical masquerade? What if all beginnings in difference without hope of unity, or more exactly indifference, which in its deferring action gathers itself only in dividing itself? What if such a difference at the place of the origin and the taking the place of origin is the condition for there being a Geschick, even a Geschick of being? A dispensation of being and time, of the present and of representation. Continuing paragraph 2 here. And of representation. The issue of origins come to the head in dealing with representation, the metaphysical basis of the modern age. According to Heidegger, representation of every sort is a matter of a subject setting before, Vorstellen, himself or herself, an object, Gegenstand, conceived as standing over against this same subject. Representing thus construed is in turn subsumed under the more general operation of enframing, Gestell, that setting upon which sets upon man, i.e. challenge him forth to reveal the real in the mode of ordering as standing reserve. It is altogether characteristic of Derrida to launch a deconstructionist reading of Heidegger by posing a question of translation. Is representatio adequately captured by Vorstellung? This is not merely one problem of translation among others. It raises the problem of translation itself. It raises the latter problem insofar as translation is thought to be a mere matter of representing an identical, unchanging sense in two or more natural languages. Such a view of translation presumes that there is A, such a thing in general as a minimum and shared semantic kernel, B, such a kernel for the word representation, and in particular Derrida questions both presumptions. On the one hand, the very notion of a semantic core is only one more instance of a transcendental signifier, feigning to stand free from the aberrant itineraries of signifiers. On the other hand, the multiple meanings of representation in its diverse epistemological, aesthetic, political, etc. acceptations defies reduction to a single operation of vorstellen, just as it resists synthesis under anything comparable to the gathering action of Gestell. We are left with the irreducibility of the re, such as it is also found in other key words, e.g. repetition, remarque, retrait, renvoi, restance, this constituting a veritable re-series comparable in import to Heidegger's G group, like Gestell, Geschick. Derrida fastens on this prefix and performs upon it a double gesture, at once extracting it from the palionym representatio, and grafting it back on with the extended meaning of repetition. Representatio is ineluctably representatio, not as the mere reappearance of an originary and now lost because past presence, but as a generative act of repetition that precedes presence itself. In a word, the presence of the present, which is embodied in representation of all sorts, is derived from repetition and not the reverse. As repetition is the production of difference within the same, and not at all a return to the strictly self-identical, the originary activity of representation as a representation is disseminative rather than gathering or unifying. With this programmatic point in hand, Derrida can add that Heidegger's epochal interpretation of the age of representation as derivative from the era of Greek presence, however admirable indirect this derivation may be, itself depends on an unanalyzed model of representation as delegation of power. This lands Heidegger in an embarrassing ontological circle. That is, representation, qua enframing or picturing, relies upon an ontogenesis or Seinsgeschick, which can be understood only on the basis of another sense of representation, which is left unclarified in Heidegger's text. The deconstructionist tactic is familiar. The subordinate term, i.e. representatio, of a metaphysically determined binary opposition, a term supposedly derivative from the dominant term presence as Anwesenheit, is shown to be subversely operative within the opposition itself, being its secret motor, and being even determinative of the dominant term, as in the comparable case of speech/writing. It is less a matter of the return of the repressed than of the insidious power of the repressed itself to undermine the repressing force from within. Representation undermines presence at and in its own epochal game. That is actually something I read last time, but I think was well worth repeating actually. Now into number 3 here in this amazing article. No one gets away scot-free in the deconstructionist enterprise, not even the deconstructor. Tua res agitur. Deconstruction can be turned back against itself. In fact, Derrida has just demonstrated this in the case of Heidegger, himself a masterful deconstructor avant la lettre. It would not be difficult to show Derrida dismantling himself in turn. And in the very present instant, must he not presuppose some core sense of representation after all? If the critique of Heidegger as a crypto-representationalist is to work, if there is no such core or set of connected cores, if it is entirely a matter of semantic mirage, how can representation be coherently invoked in holding that Heidegger is making a suspicious use of it? To make his argument work, Derrida has to allow at least one meaning of representation to be held constant, to wit, that of representation qua delegation. This meaning must perdure in and through the juxtaposition of the deconstructing and the deconstructed texts. Or else their nebeneinander der Stellung would be senseless indeed. Either such a perduring meaning is truly exceptional, requiring a special plea that Derrida does not make, or it is altogether normal, thereby calling into question Derrida's general project of subverting the very idea of an invariable identity of sense. One cannot have it both ways. How true. Much the same problem is evident when the critical deconstructionist claim is made that the idea of repetition and return resides in the very meaning of representation. Surely, the very meaning of representation implies a constant semantic kernel, akin to what Husserl would term in his logocentric Odyssey, the noimatic nucleus of sense. The deconstructibility of a deconstructionist is much graver matter than, say, the psychoanalyzability of a psychoanalyst. The latter surprises no one and would even be welcomed as salutary by an honest psychoanalyst. But an explicitly deconstructionist text aspires to a degree of self-probity and self-transparency that should leave no undeconstructed residue, at least none that would put into question a principal claim of that same text. Yet the fact is that Derrida cannot dispense with the notion that he has himself gone to pains to deconstruct. There is in Derrida's text, if not a return of the repressed, a deferred display of the deconstructed. How dare he? Let's get into 4 here. If representation, as employed by Heidegger, has thus been rather thoroughly deconstructed, and this same deconstruction seen as a subject to an auto-deconstruction within the deconstructing text, with what are we left? Derrida's answer is renvoi, pure referrings backs, referrals. Of this, Derrida says, as soon as there are renvoi, and it's always already something like representation, no longer waits, as, in parenthesis, as in Heidegger's Apocalypse. End of citation. And we must perhaps arrange to tell this story differently, from renvoi of renvoi to renvoi of renvoi, in a destiny which is never certain of gathering itself up, of identifying itself, or determining itself. Sending. In the perpetual deferment of difference, there are only traces making continual referrals, not references to other traces. Rather than worry about the barely suppressed metaphysics at play here, in parenthesis, especially when the tracing action of the renvoi is said to be the condition 324 of Heideggerian Geschick, I would like to take up just one aspect of the deferring implicit in the renvoi, namely its memorial and still more specifically its commemorative dimension. The issue of origins here becomes that of how, if at all, origins are to be commemoratively recalled. If everything begins by referring back, par le renvoi, that is to say, does not begin, everything is in effect a memory trace. But of what? If not a beginning, then of an absent origin. Everything begins by forgetting this origin. The beginning of Western thought is not the same as its origins. The beginning is rather the veil that conceals the origin, indeed an unavoidable veil. The origin keeps itself concealed in the beginning. What is called thinking, the Heideggerian text, which I truly recommend, from page 152. On this view, when we think back to the origins of Western philosophy, we think back not to an event in history, i.e. a beginning point, but to an event of withdrawal, ultimately the withdrawal of the ontological difference between being and beings. Now we come to the juicy part. Now I understand why this text miraculously was handed down. Thinking back in this way, even though it is a recalling a moment of oblivion, is for Heidegger a commemorative act, an act of Andenken. Otherwise put, in practicing Andenken, we commemorate the trace in a text of the withdrawal of the trace of the ontological difference. Nowhere is Derrida's acid skepticism more manifest than just here. Not only has the Urtrace of the ontological difference disappeared, as Heidegger himself acknowledged, but the very trace of this trace has vanished as well. Where Heidegger locates and commemorates the trace of the Urtrace in, say, a fragment of Anaximander, Derrida will claim that the Urtrace has vanished without a trace in the pre-Socratic text. as against Heidegger's view that a text can gather traces that preserve forgotten traces. Derrida contends that, considering as a pure renvoi, no trace preserves anything, any memory of any event, including an event of withdrawal. Far from making preservation possible, Anaximander text exhibits the absolute erasure of the early trace, of the ontological difference. Such is the direct consequence of a doctrine of textual dissemination. Even if a given text contains renvoi to a concealed origin, these referrals in no way sustain this putative origin or its concealment. Recourse to commemorative thinking becomes pointless when origins are regarded as so hopelessly irretrievable. Hence, the conspicuous omission in Derrida's writing of anything like Andenken, which was for Heidegger an increasingly indispensable notion. This is incredibly good. It's when you want to show something, the meaning of representation, at least in one case, has to be stable. So you are introducing the transcendental signified to some extent. That's the price you have to pay to become understandable. And of course, Derrida is guilty of this, but he doesn't attack or criticize Heidegger from the viewpoint that he never commits this error. But he's still pointing and saying that some sort of transparency must be in this particular case. And maybe only in the writing of Heidegger's work, because he's the arche deconstructor. So it is a little bit like taken directly from the text. This meaning must perdure in and through the juxtaposition of the deconstructing and the deconstructed text, or else their Nebeneinanderstellung would be senseless indeed. Either such a perduring meaning is truly exceptional, requiring a special plea that Derrida does not make, or it is altogether normal, thereby calling into question Derrida's general project of subverting the very idea of an invariable identity of sense. One cannot have it both ways. Much the same problem is evident when the critical deconstructionist claim is made that the idea of repetition and return resides in the very meaning of representation. Surely, the very meaning of representation implies a constant semantic kernel akin to what Husserl would term, in his logocentric odicity, the noematic nucleus of sense. The deconstructibility of a deconstructionist is much graver matter than, say, the psychoanalyzability of a psychoanalyst. The latter surprises no one and would even be welcome as a salutary by any honest psychoanalyst. But an explicitly deconstructionist text aspires to agree of self-probity and self-transparency that should leave no undeconstructed residue. Or at least none that would put into question a principal claim of that same text. Yet the fact is that Derrida cannot dispense with the notion that he has himself gone to pains to deconstruct. There is in Derrida's text, if not a return of the repressed, a deferred display of the deconstructed. And now we go back to 4 again. Sorry about that, but it is so widely interesting. If representation as employed by Heidegger has thus been rather thoroughly deconstructed, and this same deconstruction seen as a subject to an auto-deconstruction within the deconstructing texts, with what are we left? Derrida's answer is renvoi, pure referring back, referrals. Of these, Derrida says, as soon as there are renvoi, and it is always already something like representation, no longer waits as in Heidegger's Apocalypse. And we must perhaps arrange to tell this story differently, from renvoi of renvoi to renvoi of renvoi, in a destiny which is never certain of gathering itself up, of identifying itself, or of determining itself. Sending, in the perpetual deferment of difference, there are only traces making continual referrals, not references to other traces. Rather than worry about the barely suppressed metaphysics at play here, especially when the tracing action of the Renoir is said to be the condition of Heideggerian Geschick, I would like to take up just one aspect of the deferring implicit in the Renoir, namely its memorial and still more specifically its commemorative dimension. The issue of origins here becomes that of how, if at all, origins are to be commemoratively recalled. If everything begins by referring back, par la Renoir, that is to say, does not begin, everything is in effect a memory trace. But of what? If not of a beginning, then of an absent origin. Everything begins by forgetting this origin. And this is a quote from what is called thinking. The beginning of Western thought is not the same as its origin. The beginning is rather the veil that conceals the origin, indeed an unavoidable veil. The origin keeps itself concealed in the beginning. On this view, when we think back to the origins of Western philosophy, we think back not to an event in history, i.e. beginning point, but to an event of withdrawal, ultimately the withdrawal of the ontological difference between being and beings. Thinking back in this way, even though it is recalling a moment of oblivion, is for Heidegger a commemorative act, an act of Andenken. Otherwise put, in practicing Andenken, we commemorate the trace in a text of the withdrawal of the trace on the ontological difference. Nowhere is Derrida's acid skepticism more manifest than just here. Not only has the trace of the ontological difference disappeared, as Heidegger acknowledges, but the very trace of this trace has vanished as well. Where Heidegger locates and commemorates the trace of the trace in, say, a fragment of Anaximander, Derrida will claim that the trace has vanished without a trace in the pre-Socratic text. As against Heidegger's view that a text can gather traces that preserve forgotten traces, Derrida contends that, consider a pure Renoir, no trace preserves anything, any memory of any event, including an event of withdrawal. Far from making preservation possible, Anaximander's text exhibits the absolute erasure of the early trace of the ontological difference. Such is the direct consequence of the doctrine of textual dissemination. Even if a given text contains Renoir to a concealed origin, these referrals in no way sustain this putative origin or its concealment. Recourse to commemorative thinking becomes pointless when origins are regarded as so hopelessly irretrievable. Hence, the conspicuous omission in Derrida's writing of anything like an Andenken, which was for Heidegger an increasingly indispensable notion. With the removal of any foregathering in an origin or in its trace comes a commensurate elimination of any aftergathering in commemoration. So, he's fantastically pointing to that. Heidegger's always said in the start, there was the Amnesia, and there are traces of the before the Amnesia, the traces in text, and the beginning of the amnesia is concealed, but underneath the concealment is the amnesia, the forgotten thing. Derrida shows this to be impossible. There is no trace of the trace. That cannot be there. It cannot be there. And of course that makes absolute sense. I was not aware of this. This text is just stunning. For both Derrida and Heidegger, the metaphysical tradition is a massive, inescapable fact. But their responses to this shared perception are revealingly different. Heidegger believes it both possible and desirable to go behind this tradition by commemorating its withdrawn origins in traces left in the early words concerning being. Derrida holds out no such hope for circumvention and return. The Renoir can only gesture emptily back toward origins that seem more mocked than honored in the enclosure of the double marks. For we cannot commemorate what has not been deposited, gathered and preserved in textual traces. In Derrida's alternatively despairing and exhilarating vision, a text far from being an apt vehicle of commemoration effaces the signs of its own generation. What Derrida says of the Heideggerian text, he would also say of the text of the Western metaphysics as a whole. It is impossible to get around for others and for myself. This is so good, I'm going to repeat that. In Derrida's alternatively despairing and exhilarating vision, a text far from being an apt vehicle of commemoration effaces the signs of its own generation. What Derrida says of the Heideggerian text, he would also say of the text of the Western metaphysics as a whole. It is impossible to get around for others and for myself. One cannot get around a text so as to locate its extra-textual origin, because in the very effort to do so, one meets yet another text. Any soi-disant origin is always already pre-inscribed in the text. In short, there is only the re-inscription of one text in another, the remarking of one by the other, the tracery of the intertextuality. Here we must ask, in dealing with origins, is the choice limited to a nostalgic Andenken on the one hand and to an endless round of re-inscriptions on the other? I think not. Overlooked by Heidegger and Derrida alike is a third possibility, which I should like to call transcription, a word I borrow from Freud. In transcription, as its psychotherapeutical analog, transference, commemoration is at work, even if in no visible manner. Indeed, unlike Andenken, such a commemoration is often covert, since there may be no express remembrance of origins or tribute paid to them. Here we can concede to Derrida that origins, at least in philosophy, always come inscribed in text, even when the same texts do not refer to them explicitly. Instead of being restricted to sheer renvoi, however, a transcripted text can carry over, transfer an origin from a past text into its own textual space. Moreover, within such a space, we are not constricted to an alternative of preservation or of re-inscription, each of which is static and inherently mummifying, a matter of ingathered indivisibility. Precisely as transcriptive, the successor text is transformative, not being confined to a repeating and remarking, much less to a gathering and preserving. It effects changes in the text of the origin itself. This transformation, not to be confused with any merely progressive Aufhebung, is wrought by the transcriptive text commemorative activity. Just as the death of loved ones can transform them into active internal presences in the quietly commemorative working through effected in mourning, so the philosophers can transcribe their fading or lost traditions, not excluding the metaphysical tradition, in ways that are once continuously commemorative and yet quite self-critical. And as internalization has to be distinguished from mere incorporation in the intrapsychic realm, so transcription has to be distinguished from Andenken and re-inscription, both of which operate by the incorporation of palyonyms. If the ultimate business of philosophy is to preserve the force of the most elemental words in which Dasein expresses itself, it is part of the same enterprise to transform these words as well as to preserve and retextualize them. It is a matter of letting the paleonyms resonate in new registers of their own original significance, rather than seeking nostalgically for their pre-metaphysical moorings or incorporating, extracting, than for use as levers of intervention. Of course, we are not restricted to mourning, helpful as this may be as a model for pertinent instances of transcription. Such instances lie open before us in the writing of Heidegger and Derrida himself. For what reunites two dissident thinkers and justify their co-nomination as Heidegger/Derrida is a common capacity for creative transcription of certain philosophemes in the Western tradition. Consider only the way that in Heidegger's text, presence, Anwesenheit, transcribes ousia, aspect, Gesicht conveys idea, and the letting lie together before. Beisammen vorliegen lassen translates legein, or rather legin, Greek. Here translation indeed becomes transformation. Or gaze finally at difference, a word which literally and silently inscribes difference, the difference of Hegel and of Heidegger himself, into its internal structure. Difference is also transcribed. It becomes other than itself by its conjunction with differing, itself a transcription. Difference is also transcribed with a little connective dot. It becomes other than itself by its conjunction with differing, itself a transcription of Freud's notion of deferred action, Nachträglichkeit, and Levinas idea of the belated trace. The composite word difference thus hold together in one congenial gathering Hegel and Heidegger, Freud and Levinas, commemorating them despite its own divisive action. Instead of the decomposition of deconstruction, we witness the recomposition realized in commemorative recollection. If difference does not represent these figures, much less refer to them, it nonetheless does remember them. This late/new word, does what Derrida himself as a tactician of deconstruction disdained to do. it commemorates these very particular origins in the transcription accomplished by its own tracing. I will go back to page 606 here. So what in this article by Casey, it's exposed that Heidegger has some tendencies to crypto-representationalism. What do I feel about that? Well, I'm really happy he had, because otherwise my understanding of Heidegger would have been stopped. It was necessary at one instance, when you still remain in the metaphysical stance, to have a true origin. That true origin was the true why question. But obviously it's true, as Derrida says also. There is no trace left of the why question. It cannot be any trace left in the text of Parmenides or any other pre-Socratic. We can just assume it to be there. And in this way, Heidegger, to some little, extremely small extent, I don't think you can use size here, but I say small extent, like word-wise. To some extent, he reintroduces beings, that is representation, Anwesen, and despite himself should have known better, it is there. Derrida discovers it. And although this could be a very small criticism, an author of Sein und Zeit need to be completely transparent. The origin cannot and should not be reintroduced, because if it's reintroduced, the closure will come. I think that is Derrida's point. Maybe I'm exaggerating it a little bit, that his criticism is not that grave, but I'm not sure. My feeling for this is that by having the origin, it will be a reintroduction of the why, the trace, or the representation, sorry, the transcendental signified, I mean, of course. Hard to read and being so engaged at the same time in a text. That is quite rare. Oh. It's a double gesture that usually is the method of Derrida to avoid this reintroduction of the representation. But also it goes to show how very hard. Here we have the Grand Master of them all, Martin Heidegger, and he introduces, unbeknownst of course to himself, the representation. Isn't that interesting in itself? So you see this text has many gifts indeed. It's just extraordinary. Everything begins by referring back, that is to say, does not begin. I have to be honest, when I read that, I feel a little scared. And I think the message here is, do not be afraid. There is no danger in this. It is only the very opposite, I would say. It's the furthest from danger you can come. Everything is coming from this origin, so to speak. Well, here I reintroduced the transcendental signified. I think I'm allowed to do that. Everything that is holding in this origin, it has everything. There's no lack there. It's absolute perfection. Because what both Heidegger and Derrida showed so clearly, everything is coming from this. Although Heidegger would say that it is not something you can look at, but it has its traces, and you can trace them back, really back. You have to be willing to travel that way, and of course that is very, very far down the line as well. Oh, sorry. Forcing. Well, see what you can do here. I quickly found another article, and I'll see if we can use this insight to look at a text that somebody written about Heidegger. This is a small text, well, not small, smallish. The concept of poesis in Heidegger's An Introduction to Metaphysics. In a lecture delivered in 1935, Alexander begins, entitled An Introduction to Metaphysics. Heidegger forges what appears to be an un-Platonic link between poetry and philosophical thinking. This lecture offers the first extensive treatment of these two topics, to which Heidegger will dedicate a great deal of attention in the years to follow. This apparently unplatonic link is in fact only apparent, since the very concepts of thinking, noin, and poetry, poesis, to which Heidegger refers in this lecture are themselves unplatonic. To be precise, they are pre-Platonic, turning to the pre-Socratic thinkers, in this case Parmenides and Heraclitus. Heidegger retrieves a notion of philosophical thinking supposedly more original than that of the tradition beginning with Plato and Aristotle, for whom thinking was adapted to the model of seeing. Heidegger furthermore retrieves in Sophoclean tragedy a concept of techne, or the know-how of corresponding to the activity of poesis. And this is herstellen. That is more original than the Platonic Aristotelian interpretation of this concept understood as a form of mimesis. By way of synthesis, Heidegger then tries to demonstrate the original kinship between the notions of poesis and knowing, as they were originally conceived, but which, with Plato and Aristotle, become no longer accessible. What this kinship consists in, however, is not immediately clear. Heidegger insists upon the difference between poetry and philosophical thinking, yet he also maintains that they occupy the same order. To complicate matters further, Heidegger claims that the thinking of the pre-Socratic distinguished itself by the fact that they were still poetical, and reciprocally, the poetry of Sophocles is distinguished by the fact that he is still thoughtful. Anyone familiar with Hegelian dialectic cannot help but to call into question, at least at first, the substance of this alleged distinction between poetry and philosophical thinking, on the basis that the one appears to be to depend on the other in order to be what it is. We might begin to clarify this almost purposeful obscurity as follows. Whereas philosophical thinking is explicitly concerned with the issue of being with a big B, original poetry, while implicitly concerned with the sense of being, does not make this issue thematic. Thus, the language of the philosopher and the poet reflect this difference, even though the pre-Socratic philosophers oftentimes borrow from poetical discourse in the repression of their thinking, in the expression of their thinking, of course. Still, this explanation is obviously one-sided. It only helps clarify how original poetry was thoughtful, but does not reckon with how philosophical thinking at the inception of the tradition was poetical. To answer that, the thinking of the pre-Socratic philosophers was poetical to the extent that these thinkers often borrowed certain formal elements from poetical discourse to express the content of the thinking is unsatisfactory because it overlooks the ontological significance that Heidegger attributes to original poetry. The poetry of early Greek poets is, with respect to its content, characterized by its thoughtfulness. This means that the poetry of Greek poets is not poetical simply because the language they employ and correlative, the thinking of the pre-Socratic philosophers remains poetical even when their thinking is expressed in the language of the poets. Alternative, which resolves this aporia and at the same time points to a deeper understanding of poetry as well as philosophical thinking, is that poesis is a mode of disclosure, aletheia. Disclosure, aletheia, or being, which is consequently broader than, and so can assume the modality of either philosophical or poetical discourse. Otherwisely put, the concept of poesis furnishes the analogical unity of the poet and the philosopher. Poesis becomes the original site of being's disclosure, whether this becomes thematic in the case of the philosopher or unthematic in the case of the poet. So construed, this enables us to understand how Heidegger can explicate, auslegen, what is implicit in early Greek poetry, to illuminate his interpretation of the early Greek philosophers. So poesis becomes the original site of being's disclosure, whether this becomes thematic in the case of the philosopher or unthematic in the case of the poet. So construed, this enables us to understand how Heidegger can explicate, auslegen, what is implicit in early Greek poetry, to illuminate his interpretations of the early Greek philosophers. In this paper, I shall examine the concept of poesis articulated in an introduction to metaphysics and attempt to clarify the sense in which, according to Heidegger, it is an original site of truth. To this end, I will first examine why the issue of artistic production moves into the foreground of Heidegger's concern in the 1930s. Since this concern is animated by Heidegger's retrieval of an original concept of poesis, I shall endeavor to reconstruct the conceptual basis of this discovery. Here I hope to show how Heidegger's discovery of an original concept of poesis was, in large measure, made possible through his turn to the pre-Socratic. Let me emphasize at the start that this last claim does not imply either that Heidegger completely neglects the pre-Socratic before the 1930s, or that the concept of poesis had no role in the project of fundamental ontology. On the contrary, we can find plenty of reference to the pre-Socratic in Being and Time and other Marburg writings. And during this same period, Heidegger's interpretation of poesis plays an indispensable role in both his existential analytic of Dasein and his destructive retrieve of the Greek ontology. However, the role Heidegger assigns to the pre-Socratic and his interpretation of poiesis have an altogether different complexion in the 1930s. First, in his Marburg period, 1923 to 28, Heidegger discerns no discontinuity between, on the one hand, Plato and Aristotle, and on the other hand, the pre-Socratic thinkers. Indeed, it's clear that during this time, Heidegger views the pre-Socratics as the source of a certain prejudices that a tradition commencing with Plato and Aristotle simply takes over. The failure to distinguish the two groups of results from the fact that in this period Heidegger primarily focuses on Plato and Aristotle and therefore merely assimilates the pre-Socratic in his interpretation. So when I claim that Heidegger turns to the pre-Socratic, we can understand this as a return, provided we keep in mind that a decisive reconfiguration takes place. While in his Marburg period, Heidegger viewed the pre-Socratics, Plato and Aristotle, collectively as founders of Western philosophy. In the 1930s, he introduces a division into what was previously a unity. In an introduction to metaphysics, where this new constellation emerges for the first time, Heidegger argues that the pre-Socratic represent the original or the first beginnings, whereas Plato and Aristotle represent the end of the first beginnings, or alternatively the beginning of the second beginning. Second, the transformation which Heidegger's interpretation of poiesis undergoes in the 1930s is a complex issue which I will try to elaborate in some detail below. In brief, though, Heidegger's understanding of poiesis during the Marburg period is not conceived as an original site of disclosure of being as it is in the early 1930s. This early interpretation is limited both by the transcendental framework within which Heidegger is working and relatedly by the fact that Heidegger's understanding of poiesis at this time is mediated primarily through Aristotle. The path that Heidegger's thinking later takes, in which he attempts to free himself from this transcendental framework, opens up an even deeper horizon against which the being question is examined. In this deeper horizon, which also paves the way, I think, towards a more comprehensive interpretation of poiesis. I have organized the following discussion in three main parts. First, I will try to clarify Heidegger's interpretation of poiesis in the Marburg period. Second, I will consider some of the developments which contribute to the discovery of a more original concept of poiesis in the 1930s. Lastly, I will examine Heidegger's retrieval of the concept of poiesis as it is concretely worked out in an introduction to metaphysics. Well, I would take it like this. The understanding that came to me, from Derrida in his exposure of Heidegger as a crypto-representationalist or crypto-transcendental signified adherent, needs to be read and then sort of pushed aside, because it will be a vitamin injection to all reading henceforth, and this is much clearer to me after that. But we need not actively think so much about what Edward Casey propounded, I think. For me it's too advanced. I got a taste of it, I got a feel for it. That will be enough to help my intention, my motivation. But I would say it's too early in this series to dwell too deep in that complicated issue. Because I'd say to some point, and I think Derrida would agree to that, representation and transcendental signified is necessary, because I am situated in the transcendental signified, and when speaking to farmers, speak like a farmer, a little bit like that. If you want a farmer to do something, and what Heidegger wants is that we start doing things, and he sees thinking as a doing, not something passive. And then actually it can be defended to have a transcendental signifier, because that being in time was not written for Derrida only, it was written for me of a meeker intellect than Derrida. And for me to understand, it's necessary with a transcendental signifier. So somewhere I can have a reflection, and that reflection will help me, I would say, because this is how I, in a complicated and not very good way, as of course Rodolphe Gachet pointed out, it is still a way. It's a handicapped, limited way, but still the way. But what it paves for, is the first step on the way that leads to the paradise, so to speak. And the paradise is the understanding of the transcendental signify and reaching the why question. And stepping stone, I would say the signified is excellent. And the reading of this article by Frederick, it is now enlightened. It's interesting how Derrida in the Marburg period starts to change a little bit, not much, but still a little bit, into the direction of seeing the pre-Socratic having more of the trace, the Ur-trace, than the later ones. I say thank you very much. Very pleasant happenstance here on this highway. Have a very pleasant afternoon, and bye-bye.